Countries across the African continent have experienced, or some countries have experienced, major internet disruptions due to undersea cables being damaged. The widespread outages were reported on Thursday in countries including South Africa, Nigeria, Ivory Coast, one of the most impacted, Liberia, Benin, Ghana and Burkina Faso. Since then, services have by and large been restored in Liberia and South Africa. We speak to Arthur Goldstuck. He is the CEO and founder of Worldwide Worx. See, the subsea cables on my lips or on my tongue, Arthur, are also getting stuck there. And so let's talk about this concept of subsea cables. What are they?
Good morning, Dudu. About 99% of the world's internet traffic between continents goes via undersea cables. So the African continent obviously is heavily dependent on subsea cables for international access. And the interesting thing is that a lot of companies that are located within the continent, within South Africa, still also rely on people accessing them via those undersea cables, because the big servers, the big hubs of all the content where people essentially gather their content together and then distribute it is typically in North America or Western Europe. So when those cables go down, even local sites suffer. Less so, but they still have issues. And we have about 9 cables connecting South Africa to the world. At the turn of the century, we only had one controlled by Telkom. And that's why internet access was so slow and expensive. But since around 2009, one cable after the other has connected us. And you would think that we would then be safe from any outages. The problem is a lot of these cables run along the same routes on the seabed. And the seabed is like on land. There are mountain ranges at the bottom of the sea. There's earthquakes at the bottom of the sea. And it seems like there was some kind of earthquake on the seabed that in the same spot cut 4 cables at the same time. And suddenly our internet went down in South Africa.
Why place the cables at the bottom of the ocean?
Because that's the easiest way to run them. You can't run them on the surface of the ocean, and over land is incredibly expensive for a number of reasons. Firstly, you've got some very inhospitable geography, but you also have very inhospitable countries, and every country would have to be negotiated with to run them over land. And also over land you would have to bury them deep. So the trenching is actually the most expensive part of fiber cables on land. We have that in our cities, for example, where those of us who use fiber are getting it through fiber cables that are dug into trenches underground. And that trenching actually costs more than the cables themselves. So the beauty of running these cables on the seabed is you don't have to do trenching. They do try to bury them under the surface or under the seabed, because you still have things like ships' anchors pulling them up. In fact, that's one of the most common causes of fiber undersea cables breaking is ships' anchors. So in some parts of the world, they have to bury it under the water. But off the coast of Africa, they tend to run on the surface of the seabed, under the surface of the water, but on the surface of the seabed. And that's the cheapest way of running them.
What do we know about the infrastructure of the cables? How big are they? What sort of material is used so that they're not vulnerable to the elements, to earthquakes, or is it impossible?
So the actual fiber or optic fiber, that cable that runs within these undersea cables is the same as what we get into our homes if we use fiber to the home. It's a tiny little strand that looks like a plastic strand. It's actually a kind of a glass embedded in plastic, and it's incredibly thin. And you can fit hundreds of those into a 1-inch diameter. And the capacity of those cables is almost unlimited. It's limited only by the equipment you have on either side of it. So the cables themselves don't have to be that thick, but they are encased in armor to ensure that they can withstand almost any damage on the seabed. In the early days of cables, they weren't that well protected, and even a shark bite could break a cable. I think shark bites are less of a factor these days, but undersea earthquakes, even rock falls under the ocean, and then as I mentioned, ships' anchors are also an issue. And then now you also have in the Red Sea, for example, with the Houthi militants from Yemen attacking civilian ships, basically terrorist activity in the ocean, resulting in cables there being broken. And the Seacom cable is an example of that, which runs down the east coast of Africa. That runs through the Red Sea, like many of the other cables that connect Europe to the rest of the world. And 4 Red Sea cables were cut at the same time by the sinking of a cargo ship by the Houthis. And when the ship sank, the anchor then dragged through those cables and broke them. So right now we're sitting with something like 8 broken undersea cables, of which 5 serve South Africa. And that means all the traffic that was routed on those cables has to be rerouted on other cables. So the companies that have the contracts for their traffic to go on the cables that are broken, if they don't have contracts with the cables that are still running, well, they have to quickly negotiate them. And that's why it takes a while for the traffic to come back up again. And even today, you'll see, for example, Netflix is still giving a lot of trouble with regard to outages because their traffic clearly hasn't been effectively rerouted.
So when you say contracts, what does that mean, Arthur?
So let's say you are Netflix and you want your traffic or your movies to be delivered to South Africa. You're going to have a contract with a cable provider to ensure that your traffic can transit on their cable. Or
Are you okay, Arthur? Need some water? Arthur, are you okay? Okay. All right. Arthur Goldstuck answering a very important question there. Just had a bad cough. Arthur, I see you. Are you okay? You got some water nearby? You need anything?
Thank you.
Okay.
All good, thanks.
Alrighty, sorry. You were
Sorry
still...
about that.
No, our apologies. You were still explaining to us about the contract. So in terms... Are you okay to continue? Should we just give you 5?
Yes, give me 5, please.
We'll talk to you just now. Arthur Goldstuck, founder and CEO of Worldwide Worx. Our sincere apologies. Well, internet has been restored in some parts of Sudan's Omdurman city. The country's 3 main internet operators went offline in February, cutting off communication for millions of people stuck in the war-torn zone in the northeast African nation. Rival armed faction Rapid Support Forces denied responsibility following the blackout. The Starlink satellite internet service has now come to the rescue.
After weeks of being cut off from mobile networks due to war, some residents in Sudan's Omdurman are back online, thanks to Starlink satellite connections. The mobile blackout began in early February amid conflict between rival military factions, Sudan's army and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. It's cut people off from buying essential goods, including food, and prevented them from keeping in touch with displaced relatives. It's also hampered aid deliveries. Sudan's army provided some satellite access to residents in this district in Omdurman, where they made recent advances against the RSF. Mohammed was among those crowded around an access point.
The connection has been lost for more than a month, and people every day are hopeful. The latest thing we tried is Starlink, but there are a lot of people, and there's a lot of pressure on it. Not everyone manages to get a connection.
Fighting has caused extensive damage to the banking system, and many people have depended on the Bank of Khartoum's mobile app to transfer money and make payments. There's no cash in the country, says Amal Abdu, adding that she wants to use the app but can't log in. Telecom industry sources said previously that the RSF had shut down networks after threatening to do so unless the army restored disabled connections in the western region of Darfur. State-owned Sudani has restored coverage in parts of Sudan, but swaths of the country, including the capital and most of Darfur, remain cut off. The war between the army and the RSF erupted in mid-April 2023 over tensions linked to a planned political transition. The conflict has led to a major humanitarian crisis, with nearly 6.5 million people displaced within Sudan.
Okay, let's continue our conversation with the CEO and founder of Worldwide Worx, Arthur Goldstuck, who is speaking to us about some undersea cables that have been damaged, affecting internet connectivity in some parts of the African continent. Arthur Goldstuck, you good?
Yes, thank you very much.
You would think that in 2024 there's something we could do to get water across the TV screen so we could just lend a help. Maybe AI will help. We'll see how it goes. But
I think it will.
you were still explaining to us, Arthur, in terms of the contract and how that works. So if you are Netflix and you want to get your content to South Africa?
Yes, you would have to have a contract with a cable provider for that traffic to transit from where Netflix provides it in North America through to anywhere else in the world. And they do have local hosts or local servers where they cache the most popular content. But as we discover when these things go down, that's not usually a guarantee of being able to access it. And for example, if you are a news provider in South Africa, a major news provider or an internet service provider, you have to ensure that you can get traffic to your customers, your users, from anywhere in the world. So you have to have a connection to one of the undersea cables, and you have to have a contract with that undersea cable to ensure that that traffic flows. But at the same time, you also have to have what they call redundancy. So if one cable goes down, or if there's a glitch, or if even locally where the cable lands on our coast, and there might be a glitch at the landing station, you've got to make sure that you've got access to another cable that comes via a different route and maybe through a different landing station. So some large organizations will have multiple contracts. They'll even be on all the major cables. That's quite rare. Most of them will hedge their bets and choose a few. And for example, Vodacom and MTN both actually own capacity on quite a few cables, but even they were affected, and Vodacom in particular was badly affected when those cables were cut, because no one expects 4 cables to be cut at the same time as there's another cable running up the other coast of Africa also affected. So it makes the job of internet service providers very complex and very expensive. So I wouldn't be surprised once all these cables are up and running again to see service providers increasing their rates in order to cover the costs of having to make these repairs. It's incredibly complex and incredibly expensive to repair an undersea cable.
So those costs would then impact the end user, Arthur? You and I?
I expect that it will.
Okay. So if we take a look at how should we understand it, because you find that when there's no electricity sometimes, network providers in the country will tell you, well, we don't have electricity. And now we see subsea cables being damaged and there's disruptions to internet connectivity. How does that work? Which one is it?
So when an undersea cable goes down but the power is still up, you would still be able to get access to those sites if the traffic was being rerouted via a different path. But for example, Microsoft 365, which is what most people use if they use Microsoft Office, is now based in the cloud. It's no longer on people's computers. They have to access it via the internet. And that is hosted internationally, not here in South Africa. They should have what they call peering arrangements, and they should have caching of existing content locally. But when you're sending email and receiving email, that's all new content all the time, and it means it has to flow internationally. And clearly Microsoft's contracts for the transit of that traffic was on the compromised cables, because it took quite a few hours before they were able to come back again. They weren't able to reroute automatically. So if you were using the internet and you didn't experience disruption, it probably meant that your service provider had contracts or relationships in place that allowed them to switch immediately. Sometimes it can take a little while to switch, but if you're not back up and running within 2 hours, you know that your service provider hasn't really done their homework in terms of who they should be using for backup and for redundancy.
Arthur, no doubt this has also been debated, but quite curious because we've seen pictures of the shipwreck of the Titanic. And so when you have such infrastructure under the sea or in the ocean, the risks, are there any, or what has been done to mitigate the risks to humans in general when you put things like these in the ocean? I know it's been done for a number of years, but is it something to at least think about?
The big risk is the cost and complexity of it. It's not really a risk to human beings because they're not diving under sea. They have special ships that firstly lay down the cables and are designed to work with these cables, and then ships that are designed to repair the cables. But there are only a few because it's so specialized and cables break so seldom. You're not going to have fleets of ships patrolling the ocean. So when a cable breaks, you actually have to get a ship in port, let's say in Portugal, for argument's sake, and that ship has to be loaded with the right equipment and the right cable repair components, let's say, for that specific cable that is broken. And that can take a while because the exact cable that is going to be used to repair the break might not be immediately available. And it's expected to take a couple of weeks for that ship to reach the point where the break actually happened. Then they're going to have to lift the cable from the bottom of the ocean, and they have equipment to do that, cranes with long cables and the like, and grapple hooks that will pull the cable onto the surface, both sides of the break, and they'll be able to examine the break, and only then will they know exactly what happened and the extent of the damage and exactly what will be needed to fix it. So if they've done their homework properly, and if they're also lucky, they will have the right stuff on board to repair that cable, and that can take another week or so. So the actual repair is probably the quickest part of all. It's getting the ship out there that takes the longest, and we're still waiting for the ship to head out to the cable break.